But yeah, it's been a struggle with the process. So I will let you know if I do come.
I mean, I had a lot of problems too, because I originally, obviously, am from Russia, and then I lived in the US, and that really confused them. They didn't know what to do with it, and they required so many documents. And it's ridiculous when you think about how many. I mean, there are tens of thousands of people who came directly from Russia and Ukraine over the last couple of years, and they didn't have all of their paperwork.
Exactly.
They couldn't. So why are they doing this to people like you? It's
exactly.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. We'll just be starting in just a few minutes.
As we wait for the webinar to start, I'll be promoting everybody from attendee to panelist. Please accept my invitation so that you can turn on your cameras and participate in the webinar and ask questions during the Q&A portion. If by some reason you don't receive an invitation from me, just raise your virtual hand and I'll go back and send a new invite. Hello, Charles.
Hi, you can see me? I'm on
Yes, we can.
Very cool.
We're just waiting another minute for people to join us before we start.
Cool. I'm having a problem with my internet.
Okay. Hello, everybody. If you haven't yet, please accept my invitation to be promoted into panelists so that you can turn on your camera and your microphones during the Q&A portion. Thank you so much. Okay, Charles, I think whenever you're ready, we can get it started.
Okay, so everybody welcome to the seminar series. I'm having a little issue with my internet, so I can't see you, but apparently I'm online. So I'll be brief. So it's a pleasure to introduce you to Izabella Tabarovsky in the Wolf ISGAP seminar series on critical anti-Semitism studies. The purpose of this seminar series is to create a conceptual framework to understand and analyze contemporary anti-Semitism. Izabella is a research fellow at ISGAP. In addition, she's a senior program associate at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center and a contributing writer to Tablet magazine. Her research and writing focuses on issues of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism on the left, Soviet Jewry and the Holocaust in the USSR, and Stalin's repressions and politics of historical memory. Izabella is really, I think, a leading light on the study of anti-Semitism and how the left-wing or Soviet propaganda of the history is informing some of the anti-Semitism context. So it's really an honor to have Izabella with us today. So Izabella, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Charles, and it's great to be here. Thank you for ISGAP for the amazing work that it does, and I just feel so happy to be and honored to be a part of it. So the title of my talk today is inspired by the writings of a British philosopher, Qasim Qassam, specifically his book called Conspiracy Theories. And Qassam views conspiracy theories as a form of political propaganda. And I found this book so illuminating and so intriguing because when I came across this, I was already thinking about anti-Zionism as we experience it today as being grounded in conspiracy theory or significant parts of contemporary anti-Zionism. And I will actually spend the bulk of my talk today talking about that and the kind of Soviet precursors of that line of thinking. But the main thesis of my talk, which some of you know is really the main thesis of my overall research, is that contemporary anti-Israel left reproduces with extraordinary fidelity the motifs, the tropes, and the explanatory logic of the post-1967 Soviet anti-Zionism. Okay, that's part of my thesis. And the other part is that late Soviet anti-Zionism, the anti-Zionism that developed after the Six-Day War, after 1967, was inherently conspiracist, was grounded in classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory of the protocols of the elders of Zion. And so this is what I'm really going to talk about today. But this is where Qassam's ideas really interested me, because once you understand that part of the DNA of contemporary anti-Zionism can be directly traced to anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, then it opens up a whole different perspective on how we can approach to fight it. It sort of opens new strategic avenues of action, I think. So to be clear, Qassam doesn't discuss anti-Zionism, but he does discuss anti-Semitic conspiracy that they're a form of political propaganda. And the point of a conspiracy theory is to promote a political or ideological agenda rather than to tell the truth. I think that's something that's very obvious to us when we think about kind of the wide spectrum of conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitism. But also when we think about anti-Zionism, when we think about things that we encounter out there online, what people say about Israel and Zionism, it definitely is not driven by desire to tell the truth. So, so Qassam talks about conspiracy theory entrepreneurs, so people who promote conspiracy theory knowingly in order to achieve certain political goals, sometimes it can be financial goals, right? People who are trying to really make hay out of whatever they're saying, which has no relationship to the truth. Why do people follow these ideas? Why do people spread conspiracy theories? In Qassam's view, it's because they're seductive. And they tell stories that people want to hear. This is what he says. And this idea also intrigues me very much because it kind of helps explain perhaps why we fail in fighting anti-Israel demonization. We face stories and narratives that people don't want to give up. They're seductive. They grab people's attention. And when we try to fight them with facts alone, which I think is a lot of times what we do, Qassam says, look, experience suggests that conspiracy theorists tend not to be persuaded by arguments against their theories, and they're not persuaded by facts alone. So I think that if we think about anti-Zionism as a conspiracy theory, then it helps us understand where there are holes in our arguments and our attempts to fight it, because it's not enough to fight with facts. Facts are important, but it's not enough. There must be other strategies as well. Let's see. I just want to skip through this part so that we can focus on the main part of my presentation. So another thing that's important, I think, is Qassam says that conspiracy theories aren't just theories. They're expressions of a particular view about how the world works. They can't be shaken without changing the conspiracy theorist's overall worldview. So this also I find intriguing because, again, it helps us understand why we fail over and over again to shake that worldview, right? We present, expert opinions. We present great research to defeat anti-Zionist rhetoric, and it doesn't work because for these people, for this really dedicated group of anti-Zionists and anti-Israel on the Israel left, it's so interwoven with their worldview, and it's so interwoven with everything else that they do, that to give that up, to be persuaded that they're wrong, would mean to really give up a lot. And so people really choose not to do that. So this perspective that Israel is irredeemably evil, the belief that Zionism is irredeemably evil, it's really woven into the view of portions of the left. So Kassam says the conspiracy theorists are above all propagandists. They pretend to be serious researchers, but the reality is that their theories tend to be politics-based rather than evidence-based. So I'm very much interested in pursuing this line of thinking and understanding anti-Zionism as conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theory as political propaganda opens a whole new kind of avenue of exploration and thinking. So I'll get to some of the implications of it at the end of my talk. So let me start by repeating the thesis of my research, and that is that, or the main argument of my research, and that is that today's left recreates many of the tropes of Soviet anti-Zionism with an extraordinary accuracy. So to be clear, we're talking about post-1967. So the Soviets were always anti-Zionist. That was from the very beginning. You know, Lenin was anti-Zionist. But it was in 1967 that Soviet anti-Zionism really acquires this conspiracist dimension. And it also acquires really powerful political imperatives, both external and domestic. And it acquires a global dimension. After 1967, Soviet anti-Zionism goes global. The Soviets really tried to reach the global left and post-colonial developing world with their ideas. And I believe they really succeeded. So let me show you a few slides. Some of you may have seen them, but hopefully this will still be interesting. Let's see. All right, so I want to start with this slide, which is, it comes from a cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a French edition that was published in the 1920s. So this is an obviously, you know, it says the Jewish danger. This is an anti-Semitic caricature. We recognize it immediately from this kind of exaggerated Jewish features of the spider. The spider is holding the world in his tentacles. If you can't see it, on the cap of the spider, you see a 5-pointed star. So this is a Bolshevik Jew who is attempting to conquer the world. The birth of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth is right here. It's evident in this picture. This was kind of the main direction of the anti-Semitic propaganda at the time. And once again, so this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? It illustrates the main tropes of that book very, very well. Now let's look at this picture. This is a picture that was taken, it's a photograph that was taken in 1972 in Moscow at a May Day parade. And those of you who read Russian or speak Russian, don't give away what I'm trying to do here. But, you know, here, obviously here we have also an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jew. We have a Jew presented as a spider once again, right? We have the Star of David, we have the crooked nose, we have the tentacles kind of holding the world, right? Like I see this presentation of the web as kind of being also a symbol for the globe, right? So the question arises, how is it that in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, you could parade such an anti-Semitic caricature through the streets of Moscow? Because remember, the Soviet Union was officially a country that prohibited anti-Semitism. They announced they believed that they had conquered anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was illegal. So how is it that we have such an open display of anti-Semitism? And the answer, of course, lies in the words that we see to the left of the spider. Zionism is the weapon of imperialism. So in the Soviet eyes, this is not an anti-Semitic presentation, it's an anti-Zionist presentation. And of course, I don't think I need to tell this audience that it's a pretty flimsy cover, even if they really believed that this is what they were saying, because the main presentation here is the image. And the Soviets actually knew this really well, that in propaganda, images are much more powerful than words. So you have an anti-Semitic presentation here, and it's essentially the same presentation here. But this, only the words change, right? The languages change. But this particular parade float, I think, was copied from this caricature, this cartoon that appeared in the USSR, I think in 1970 or so. So it predates the May Day parade float. And here we clearly see, again, anti-Semitic presentation of a Jew, right? A classic kind of presentation of a Jew that's both subhuman and super powerful, right? A Jew holding the world in his hands. The title, I'll tell you the title of the cartoon in a moment, but once again, if you can't read Russian, then it's an anti-Semitic cartoon. If you can read Russian, then you know that on the back of the spider, it says Zionism. So once again, there is an attempt to say this is not anti-Semitic, this is anti-Zionist. And the title of the cartoon is something like a Zionist spider at his favorite work. So what is the favorite work of the spider? It is expressed in the words that are kind of woven into the web, and that's lies, provocations, anti-Sovietism, anti-communism, and the Jewish question. And the Jewish question is here because Soviet propaganda always said that Zionists always kind of trigger the resurrection of the Jewish question. You know, they always say that, they always accuse everybody of anti-Semitism, and they do it only to draw attention away from the criticism of Israel. Sound familiar? I think that we hear the same rhetoric today, right? That Zionists accuse people of anti-Semitism in order to deflect from the criticism of Israel. So this is, I think that these three images for me are really a very clear illustration of how Soviet anti-Zionism, which again, this is after 1967, which they pushed out to the world, really wove into it very clearly identifiable anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes. So here I wrote up just a few instances of where there was a correspondence between what the Soviets said after 1967 and what the protocols of the Elders of Zion say. So the protocols talk about international Jewry. The Soviets introduced the idea of international Zionism, right? With the same kind of implications. There is this evil force, international Zionism, that operates behind the scenes and pulls the strings on the world, and it's as evil as dangerous as the protocols would have identified international Jewry to be. In the protocols, we read about Jews controlling the media. In Soviet propaganda, we read about Zionists controlling the media. In the protocols, we read about Jews controlling politics and manipulating world events behind the scenes. The Soviets said that about Zionists. In the protocols talk about Jews indoctrinating youth with poisonous ideas. The Soviets talk about Zionists indoctrinating youth with poisonous ideas. So there is a very direct correspondence. And it's in Soviet propaganda after 1967 that some of the tropes that are so familiar to us today emerge. That Zionism is a form of racism, the equation between Zionism, Nazism, and fascism, the idea that Jews are not a people and don't deserve a state. By the way, I should say that Soviet propaganda, today's left actually outstrips Soviet propaganda, because the Soviets officially never said that Jews don't deserve a state. They never said that Israel needs to be eliminated. But of course, they financed people who then proceeded to try to wipe out Israel from the face of the earth. The idea that Zionists foment anti-Semitism for their own political purposes, I mentioned that. The idea is that Zionists benefited from the Holocaust, right? We hear that today all the time, and also collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust. This is a slightly more kind of, that exists in more rarefied parts of the far left, but it's very much present. The idea that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same. Every piece of Soviet propaganda said this, literally. They really, really insisted that what they were doing was not anti-Semitic, it was anti-Zionist. They actually had a logic behind it, which it took me a little bit of time to figure out, and we can talk about that. But essentially, I'll just say that I think that they felt they could say it because they loved some Jews. They only couldn't accept some some categories of Jews. So they rejected religious Jews and they rejected Zionist Jews, but Jews who joined them in the socialist enterprise were fine. And by the way, the reason they didn't have a problem with Israel is because the only problem in Israel, they said, was that it was under Zionist heel. If the workers of Israel remove the Zionist leadership, they said, then Israel will be fine. So you see, it's like this funny play there. But the key part in all of it, or in much of it, is this conspiracism, the idea that Zionists are so powerful that they hold the world in its grip. Zionists own the United States. Zionists own the politics in America. They own the the media in America. They're Zionists who run banks. You see that in Soviet propaganda all the time. And so that gives that their whole propaganda that very conspiracist sense. Okay, so we already made this comparison. All right, so one thing that the Soviets created, I'll let you look at this lovely face, was sort of a fake academic discipline called scientific anti-Zionism. And I wrote about it a little bit in a piece that I just published about Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation in Tablet. I traced some of it there. So they charged academic institutions with developing scientific critique of what they referred to as international Zionism. So of course, the critique was nothing but a confirmation of political and ideological perspectives. There was absolutely nothing scholarly about it, but it's a really interesting historical example of how the academia gets woven or gets pulled into providing justifications for certain political and ideological positions. So the Soviets produced an incredible amount of literature, hundreds, thousands of books, tens of thousands of articles. They published this literature in literally every language under the sun. They spread it to I think somewhere I saw 130 countries, so basically every country in the world. So this literature was extremely formulaic, which of course is a critical aspect of propaganda. It repeated the same ideas over and over again. We'll look at some examples in a moment. It never questioned these ideas. So even though this was supposed to be scholarship, there was never real questioning of the ideas. The idea was to really restate the same position over and over again. But because it wanted to look scientific, it was filled with footnotes. And so you can trace the origins of some of these ideas and tropes that it produced. And so again, in this piece that I wrote about Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, I looked, I kind of show an example of how when you trace these footnotes, which are supposed to make these works look impressive, you really see what a kind of, what's the word? What's a profanation of scholarship it is, because they would distort the original sources. They would distort the quotes. They created a system of circular references where it appears as though lots and lots of scholars independently come to the same conclusions, whereas in reality, you had a group of Zionologists, one of whom is portrayed here, who all knew each other, who belonged to the same circle. They were tasked with smearing Zionism. They were simply echoing each other over and over again. So they're all referencing one another, and it makes it look as if it's, so many independent scholars came to the same conclusion, which of course there's nothing of the kind. And so when you read this literature and really trace it, you see that there is nothing authentic about it. There is nothing truly kind of social justice or Marxist or revolutionary about it. There is no true care for what happens to the Palestinian people. It's all driven by Soviet external and domestic political interests, which we can get into if that interests you, what those interests were. It's all highly engineered, driven from the top, essentially by the Soviet foreign policy and security establishment. And it's produced by people like this person here, Yevgeny Yevseyev, who were actually part of a right-wing, great Russian nationalist movement, which arose in the Soviet Union in the late 50s and 60s, and it was deeply anti-Semitic. Now, I think it's a really important point that, it's possible to say, well, okay, so what if today's left repeats Soviet propaganda? This is all part of socialist thinking. It's all part of left-wing thinking. We on the left today are socialists, so we take the best from the Soviet Union. For example, the fact that it was anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. But when you look at the people who actually produced these ideas, they were deeply anti-Semitic. Some of them read Hitler, they read Nazi ideology, they read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This person here, in fact, has been traced. He was one of the most prolific Zionologists. This was the term for this group of people. And he was an Arabist by training who spent some years at the Soviet embassy in Cairo. And there he encountered the Egyptian anti-Israel propaganda, which at the time was actually run by a former Nazi. So we see in some of his articles references to the brochures that were put out by that institute, that Egyptian institute. We also see in some of his articles references to pre-Soviet Russian Black Hundred pogromist literature. So this is the Black Hundreds were the far-right ultranationalist Russian groups who instigated pogroms against the Jews. So he quotes from that literature. And he occupied a very prestigious place at a prestigious Soviet Institute of Philosophy, that was very much drawn into this effort of justifying Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. So this is just one example. When he died, one of the Russian historians examined his papers and found, I mean, his anti-Semitic views cannot be doubted. It's very, very clear and very, very disturbing. So essentially then what we're having, if today's left repeats ideas that were created in the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, then it's repeating ideas that were produced by people like this. And this is actually really, I find it really troubling, this idea. Okay, so this is just a photograph of some of the books that were produced at the time. And so here, I want us to look at some of the terminology that appears in some of these books. So Fascism Under the Blue Star, hang on, let me rearrange my screen. Fascism Under the Blue Star was the best-selling book of Evgeny Yevseyev, whose face you just saw. So it's a pretty slim volume. So what do you find in this volume? This volume was actually, it was even noticed in the West. It produced a lot of uproar. The Washington Post mentioned it, but it remained kind of a perennial bestseller. It was written in the 70s. So first of all, the term that appears the most times is Jewish last names. Jewish rich Jews, 236 times. So Yevseyev goes on and on and on about rich Jews who own everything, and then he calls them Zionists. But this is basically the same idea that you find in far-right propaganda, right? Jewish last names, Jews who own everything. So the idea here is that Zionists own everything. Banker, 92 times. Zionist propaganda, 71 times. Imperialism, 67. Obviously, trying to create a link, trying to associate Zionism with bankers, with propaganda, with imperialism. Then you have Africa, that's repeated 54 times. And that's because the Soviets really made a big effort to connect Israel with apartheid Africa. And so they talked a lot about how Zionist influence was so negative in Africa, and Zionists, Jews in South Africa collaborated with Israeli Zionists. So that appears a lot of times. Aggression, aggressor, 50 times. Reaction, reactionary, 45 times. So you see a kind of a chain of associations that's being created, right? So Zionism is aggressive, Zionism is reactionary, Zionism
Izabella,
is
sorry, when was this published? What year?
So this is 1970s. I can check. I think it's 73, 72, 73. I can check and I can give that to you for sure.
Thanks.
Okay. This comes also from the same book. This is a scheme that makes me think of, I think David Miller, if anybody knows, this British sociologist, that is credited British sociologist. He always puts together schemes of, various connections between different Jews. So these are what you have in the boxes here are Jewish last names. And so this is how these are supposedly Jews who own the trading houses and financial institutions in the US, who participate in financing Zionist activities. So you have Cohens and Lazars and Lehmans and the Dreyfuses and the Goldmans, and I'm sure that, Rothschild is there. So, I mean, this is a very anti-Semitic kind of image. Okay, I'll give you a few more examples of repetition of certain terminology. So this is the ideology and practice of international Zionism, also sometime in the 70s. It was a collected volume. Different Zionologists participated in this publication. Okay. So again, you see imperialism appears 158 times, right? Reactionary, 110 times. Racist, 107 times. Aggression, sabotage, subversion. That's another one that you often see in Soviet propaganda, that Zionists operate in cahoots with global intelligence services. They attempt to sabotage and subvert socialist societies and socialist groups. So there is that very clear kind of undercurrent that we also see in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination, another Soviet book that was published in the 70s. So here you see an association between Zionism and Israel as an occupation, occupy, again, aggression, racism, terror, colonialism, intelligence espionage, secret services spying. So these are the top terms that appear in the book, again, creating a specific chain of associations. So if you think about that, there are hundreds of books that appear with the same kind of associations, and there are tens of thousands of articles that appear with the same kind of associations, and they're produced in dozens of languages and pushed out to the world. I mean, that's a pretty powerful kind of infusion of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist rhetoric into the global conversation. And here I just photographed a few screenshots, put together a few screenshots of English language books that were put out. It's just a fraction of what exists, but you see here just from the title, Zionism is an instrument of imperialist aggression, reaction, Zionism, a form of racism, Washington and Tel Aviv against the Arabs, enemy of peace and progress, and of course Zionism is the enemy of peace and progress. Zionism counts on terror. And think about all of this being produced in French, in Arabic, in Spanish, in German, in Hindu, and et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, so the kind of pushing out this kind of literature was one way for the Soviets to communicate these ideas to the world. You know, for that they used their propaganda apparatus, which really, it presented itself as news agencies like the Novosti news agency, the TASS news agency. But, you know, here we have to understand that the Soviets understood journalism, international journalism, as part of their kind of foreign policy apparatus. You know, journalists were trained in the same institutions that the Soviet diplomats were trained. And so the idea that, you know, there was nothing truly journalistic about what they put out. Here's an interesting example. So in 1971, the New York Times carried an article by a known Soviet propagandist. I don't know if the New York Times understood him to be a propagandist. He was presented as a political analyst. So this article was called The Soviet View on Jews, but its original title was actually something like The Stormtroopers of Neo-Nazis or something like that. And we know about it because there is a memo that describes the placing of this article, a Soviet memo that describes the placing of this article. So, you know, kudos to the New York Times editors. They changed the kind of bombastic title, but these ideas appear in the publication itself. So the article kind of goes, attacks Mir Kahane and the Jewish Defense League, because at the time the JDL was really attacking the Soviets and terrorizing them. But, you know, and that's something that obviously most American Jews would not have disagreed with the Soviets on. I think that for a lot of American Jews, they really detested the JDL and Kahane. But what he also does in this piece is then he kind of extends these ideas, right? That you get the sense that all Zionists, all American Jews who support Zionists in Israel share these ideas. You know, it's racist, it's fascist, it's neo-Nazi. It gets in the way of good relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. So again, sabotage, you know, Zionist sabotage, good international relations, and American Jews really need to think about whether they want to be Zionist or not. So this is I would say that this is probably the best, the most important, arguably, success of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, right? Placing a piece in the New York Times is a big deal. But they also sponsored just a wide variety of left-wing publications, and not only communist ones, really a wide variety. They supported financially a wide variety of left-wing parties. And so these messages, when you read through, this is what I'm researching now, when you read those publications, you see these messages that we discussed appear over and over again. And so my theory is that these ideas simply penetrated the global left and were adopted by the global left in the 70s and 80s, and sort of became part of the default left-wing viewpoint already back then. The Soviets also worked with the embassies. There are memos that illustrate how, for example, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C. was expected to spread the message of how dangerous Zionists are and how they own Congress, and work with the Jewish community in order to create a split between pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews, and work with non-Jewish communities to also explain just how dangerous Zionism was. So there's some really fascinating memos on that score. And I believe that all embassies will probably, certainly in major countries, were tasked with the same ideas, because this is what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wanted to be communicating to the world. Here's another example. This actually relates to the Zionology concept, right? The idea that the scholarly aspect of producing anti-Zionist propaganda. This is the cover of Mahmoud Abbas's book that was based on his dissertation. And his dissertation, which he defended in the Soviet Union in 1982, equated Zionism with Nazism. And you see that expressed right here in the picture. So think about it. You know, here comes an aspiring Palestinian leader. He comes to the Soviet Union. They grant him a dissertation. He goes on to reach a very high level, very influential position, right? Since that time, it's already how many, 40 years, more than that. And, you know, these are the ideas that he is propagating. So it's a pretty big achievement, I would say, for this Soviet propaganda, which continues to play out, you know, 30 years after the country that produced it fell apart. So here, let me see how much time we have. I want to take you just through a few more images to show you just how, even kind of conceptually and image-wise, some of the things correlate that we see today on the left and some of the things that we saw in Soviet propaganda. So here on the left, you have a cartoon called The Banner of the Zionist Gang. This is 1971. It weaves together the Star of David and swastika. And the flag on the right is actually an image that you see quite a lot, I think, today. I took it from some left-wing progressive blog. Here's another example. So again, on the right, it's the cover of Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, or book that was produced based on his dissertation, kind of the Soviet idea that Zionism and Nazism are the same. And on the left is just your typical kind of placard that we see in anti-Israel demonstrations today. This is going back to that interweaving of the swastika and the Star of David. See Zionism, a racist anti-Semitic reactionary tool of imperialism. This is a contemporary brochure that I found just a couple of years ago, I think, produced by the Communist Party of Great Britain. Okay, here's another interesting cartoon. So the idea that Zionists and Israel continue the work of the Nazis. So what you have on the left is a cartoon that demonstrates, this is 1967, just 2 months after the Six-Day War. You see an Israeli soldier who is holding a weapon in the shape of a, whatchamacallit in English? Never mind, the word is escaping me, but what it says on it, what's that?
A bayonet. No?
Well, a bayonet, but never mind. What do we have during thunderstorms that strikes the, never mind. So the words that's written on it is blitzkrieg. So that's immediately, for Soviet people, that would be an immediate connection with the blitzkrieg that started the Great Patriotic War, the World War II, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. So they're already trying to say that Israelis, with their Six-Day War, that it was kind of a blitzkrieg like the Nazi blitzkrieg. In the back, you have a sign that's in Russian, it's called it says Lebensraum. So again, for Soviet listeners or readers, it would immediately make a connection with the Nazi invasion, right? Who invaded in order to get more room for the German people. And then who is speaking to this Israeli soldier? It's a Nazi ghost who's holding up a blueprint for the new order type Auschwitz. So in other words, and the title of the cartoon is A Familiar Assortment. So the Israeli is obviously supposed to be taking over from the Nazis. And on the right, you have a cartoon that won the first prize in Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest in 2005, posted on a progressive blog. So here it's a clear illustration, a clear parallel, right? They're trying to show that basically Israel is enclosing Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem in an Auschwitz-like situation. Okay, so so some of the conspiracies motifs that we see today, the AIPAC, I think, is the most clear one. I mean, I don't know another organization that's viewed with it kind of as big of a conspiracist perspective as we do with AIPAC, right? There's the view that AIPAC basically, makes or breaks candidates, and it's extraordinary to see that. The idea that Zionists control speech, that no one can criticize Israel and no one can criticize Zionism. We know that it's completely untrue, of course, but there is that idea. The idea that Zionists control the media, right? Only positive things are allowed to be said about Israel. Here's another one that I find interesting. Israel pink washes, green washes its oppression of Palestinians. I think that it's something that we see quite a lot. And what is the idea here? The idea is that, does Israel have progressive policies toward LGBTQ? Well, maybe it does, but it doesn't matter because they're really trying to use that in order to distract attention from the oppression of Palestinians. Do Israelis care about the environment? Not really, because the only reason they say they care is so that they can draw attention from the oppression of Palestinians. So there's this idea, think about how many people would have to get together in order to create this kind of a cover-up. It would never be sustained, right? It would be immediately leaked. And yet there is this belief that there is some kind of a conspiracy to whitewash, pinkwash, greenwash the oppression of Palestinians. Okay, so this is a graphic that I put together just to illustrate what I believe is the genealogy of some of the things that we hear today on the anti-Israel left. We hear there are tropes that come directly from the protocols of the Elders of Zion via this kind of chain of transmission. So on the one hand, the protocols inspired Hitler, that's a known fact. On the other hand, they also inspired Soviet Zionologists. Soviet Zionologists, by the way, also, as I mentioned, read Hitler and Nazi theory. Soviet Zionologists informed the thinking of the global left in the 70s and 80s, and which informed today's anti-Israel left. I find this idea to be deeply disturbing, especially if we consider how many Jews there are on the progressive left who also protest Zionism and Israel. It's, generations before, their great-great-grandfathers fled Russia because of the pogroms, the Russia that produced the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And today they're using a philosophy that borrows from that, indirectly borrows from that, from those tropes. So this is just something for us to think about. Now, do I have time? I want to kind of come back to this idea of political propaganda, conspiracy theory, and why it's important for us to view it, or why it helps to, how it helps us to view things in that perspective.
Yeah, so please go ahead and try to wrap it up in 5 to 10 minutes, then we can have Q&A.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
All right, so let me just find my notes. Okay, so I think why does it help us to think about anti-Zionism as a conspiracy theory and as political propaganda? I think it's an interesting analytical tool, because right now I think we're mostly locked into the one analytical paradigm when approaching this kind of conspiracy anti-Zionism, right? And that is whether it constitutes anti-Semitism or not. And it's an important question, and it's a crucial question, but it doesn't offer us too many avenues for action. And I'm going to argue that these avenues are going to be further reduced, because if we're trying to argue that anti-Zionism today is anti-Semitism, which I believe it is, right? Most of the anti-Zionism that we see today is anti-Semitic, because it's related to anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But then what are our tools? Our tools for action are to turn to the IRA definition and to try to condemn this rhetoric on the grounds that it falls within the IRA definition. But as we know, IRA is under attack, and we're all trying to save it. But whether we like it or not, I think for a considerable portion of progressives, it will be discredited, and it is already discredited. They will stop paying attention to anything that appears in IRA. And the power of IRA is being diminished also because the significance of the Holocaust itself is being diminished in that kind of left-wing discourse. And that, by the way, also goes back to the Soviets. They began 50 years ago to try to diminish the meaning and significance of the Holocaust. And because accusations of anti-Semitism are being regularly diminished, it's becoming very, very difficult to impress anyone with these accusations. I have to say, it's distressing to say it, but I think it's true. But when we consider contemporary anti-Zionist rhetoric as political propaganda, that we can begin to ask a different set of questions. We can ask, who benefits from this rhetoric, right? We can look at it, look, in Soviet times, participation in the Zionist propaganda gave you all kinds of benefits. If you joined in writing these books, it boosted your career, you got published, you got multiple and positive reviews for your writings, you got honorary, you got rewarded with trips abroad, you built connections in high-level places. And I think if we look at who participates in anti-Zionist rhetoric today, you see a lot of benefits from that. Political benefits, you get gigs, you get social media followership, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, one last thing is, why is it important to, how does it help us to think of anti-Zionist propaganda as conspiracy theory? It helps us to think, and here go back to Kassam again, in how we rebut it. So we need to rebut it based on facts, absolutely. We probably will not convince people who are really kind of deep in it. We need to focus on people who have not yet gone over to the dark side. We need to educate people, but we also really need to be pointing out, kind of out the conspiracy mongers. We need to out those people who propagate these conspiracy tropes to make sure that people have a proper understanding of the function of anti-Zionist conspiracy theory as propaganda and the causes it promotes, and just being conspiracy and not the truth. Okay, I'll stop here.
Cool. Thank you very much, Izabella, for your work in general and for the presentation today. I'm going to ask Lev. Lev, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're doing similar work. So I would like you to perhaps make the first comment or question.
Yes, sure. So first of all, Izabella, thank you for this. It is very interesting. And my question is, well, about today, do you see any signs of this kind of propaganda and the dissemination of conspiracy theories today by groups that either connected to ex-Soviet Union actors or to affiliates from Mahmoud Abbas, maybe, and so on and so on? Do others use the same techniques nowadays?
And I'll just add, Lev did some amazing work on the radical left in the UK. So maybe that's why one of the reasons why I wanted Lev to ask a question. So that's part of the, I guess, the backdrop.
Thanks.
So first of all, let me say, I can't, here we go. I want to stop sharing so that I can see everybody. Okay, here we go. I mean, I do, and I don't think that they have to be connected to the former Soviet Union. I think that those connections are harder to make, but I think it's just part of the left-wing thinking in general. I think that, you know, you see the repetition of the same kind of tropes, which, you know, you couldn't possibly invent these tropes from ground zero all over again, right? It's just the same tropes that they repeat over and over again. I think it's the conspiracist perspective, the view that Zionism is evil, inherently evil, that Israel is inherently evil and irredeemably evil. You know, I mentioned the kind of the demonization of AIPAC, the demonization of some of the things that Israel does, and kind of a refusal to believe that Israel does anything out of a sense of goodwill, right? There is a view that Israel is always covering something up. You actually saw that when the Amnesty officials presented their apartheid report here in Jerusalem. And, you know, one of them said something like, well, Israel has such a complicated governing and legal structure, you know, it's really hard to get to the bottom of what they're trying to do, meaning that Israel is trying to, and I'm paraphrasing, but the idea here is that Israel is trying to cover up apartheid. That's why it created this complex structure, right? Which is it's like, you would never say it about any other country. Israel developed complexity in response to complexity, right? But the view of the Amnesty officials is that they did it because they're trying to cover something up. So it's subtle, but it's there.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. Carrie and Holly.
Thank you for such a wonderfully documented talk. I just have an historical question. Immediately after the '67 war, there was quite a bit of anti-Zionist propaganda in a number of countries. in the US, certainly elements of the left immediately produced anti-Zionist propaganda. There was anti-Zionist propaganda, obviously, in the Arab world. What you showed in your talk is that the Soviet Union was a huge source of this kind of material. I mean, they were working pretty hard at it. So my only question is, do we really know, given that there were simultaneous instances of anti-Zionist propaganda elsewhere in the world, that the Soviet Union is really the sole origin of this kind of view? Or are there multiple origins and it's impossible to sort them out?
Well, I think this is a really crucial question. And I think it would take a really in-depth study, a multidisciplinary study, because look, I'm an expert on the Soviet Union. I'm not an expert on the New Left, and various Western leftists. I'm sure that there were multiple sources. But I think that it's that the contribution of the Soviet Union was massive. And I think that it's underestimated. When I read about the New Left and their anti-Zionist positions, I never see the Soviet Union mentioned. But then you look at what the Soviets put out, and you can look at some of the publications that they put out in the UK, or even publications they didn't necessarily put out, but sponsored, like the Morning Star. And then, for example, you look at a publication like the South African Communist, and you look at what the CPUSA was putting out. And CPUSA had a person who is documented to have traveled to the USSR, to Moscow, to learn about their anti-Zionist ideas. And then he wrote about them. It's traceable. So when you look at that and how it's all simultaneous in time, right, it's clear that there is a central action that comes from there. And it's an important contribution. To weigh that contribution against others, that would take much more research and many people. I think it would take a big team to really answer this question.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Holly, then Philip.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Izabella, for this great talk. I have a complicated question, but I don't know how you might address it. So I'm teaching a class right now on the literature of white supremacists, which I've taught before. And this time, a few weeks ago, we read the protocols together as a class. But the way that I taught it is I used the declassified FBI file on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so most of my class or my work, we're talking about the far right. We're also talking about the left, but we're talking a lot about the literature of the far right. So I opened it up for my course file real quick. What's interesting about this is looking at the declassified documents. In 1941, there was a confidential informant where he provided the protocols of the Elder of Zion to the FBI at that time. And I'm reading the direct documents here from the assistant director, and he was responded to by J. Edgar Hoover, talking about, you may be assured that I've carefully noted the contents of your communication. They're being made a matter of permanent record in this bureau. So I am interested in both how you see this historically, and of course, J. Edgar Hoover is on the right, very anti-left, right, on the opposite side of the spectrum politically. But then also, if we look at the 70s and 80s, white supremacist literature, and this is particularly what I'm studying right now or doing research on, you argued that the 70s and 80s were so big for the Soviet propaganda machine on the left, and it was solidly anti-Zionist and equated it with Nazis. Yet in America during that same period, the right absolutely equated Jews with the left and with the Nazis, and anti-Semitism was then and now a rallying point on the right. So the anti-Semitism that we're seeing it on the left, but we're seeing a huge amount of anti-Semitism now in the US coming from the right. I drove into work a couple of weeks ago. I sent this to Lev earlier, a couple of weeks ago, to a humongous professional swastika banner hanging from an overpass, right? And it's coming from the right. It's coming from Confederacy and on the right. So how do you see this working in tandem if in America, the whole 20th century till now, from the 40s up, it's solid the Zionists are solidly Marxist, solidly on the left. That is the the narrative that's being given and being promoted by the hugest group of anti-Semitic people in America. How does that square with like Great Britain or the rest of the West or the left? Thank you.
Look, I actually am moving more and more toward stopping to, like, there is, of course, a difference between the far left and the far right. But when you look at Soviet literature, for example, you really see how the ideas travel between the far right and the far left. And I think it's something that we need to really understand, because if the Soviet Zionologists borrowed ideas from the far right, this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, solidly the production of the Russian far right. So they borrow these ideas and they rewrite them in order to serve the needs of the Marxist-Leninist Soviet state, right? So they turn these ideas very easily into kind of, they make them acceptable on the left. So then when perestroika comes and the kind of suppression on the far right expression ends, the same people who created this left-wing anti-Zionist literature now use that literature to promote anti-Semitic ideas on the right. So there are far-right groups that arise that are now openly speaking about anti-Semitic ideas, and they talk about how Jews are at fault for all the chaos that is happening around them as the Soviet Union is falling apart. And they're drawing on the same literature, and it doesn't matter for them if it talks about Zionists or Jews. Now it's one big mix, and it's the same people who produce both. There's an incredible story. I wrote about it in an article that I published, I think, last summer, of a Russian neo-Nazi who became openly neo-Nazi after it became allowed to be a neo-Nazi, after, during perestroika and later, and founded a major neo-Nazi group in Russia. So apparently he was radicalized when he was going through his army training. Before he was sent to fight, he was supposed to go and fight in the Middle East, I think during the War of Attrition. And so he was given to read piles of anti-Zionist literature to prepare him ideologically to be in this environment, right? Because they thought that Soviet soldiers will face Zionist propaganda, Zionist onslaught. So that literature radicalized him to be on the far right, to join, to become a neo-Nazi. So I think it's much more complex than we often think. And you see neo-Nazi groups today use anti-Zionist language, because I think they see it being more accepted in the mainstream. So excuse my little cat here. So yeah, I don't know if it really answers your question, but this is what came up for me.
Thank you. It does. It seems to, I know it's complex, and that was kind of, I was hoping you'd address that, because it seems so often we're kind of demonizing either side, when both sides hate Jews. There's just equal opportunity hate, right? From the left and the right.
Completely, the two are linked. And this is another thing that the left needs to understand. They fail to acknowledge their history, and they also fail to acknowledge what's happening in the present, which is that they repeat the same tropes and they say the same things a little differently, perhaps in a way that's become more acceptable, but underneath, it's the same ideas. And I'll be happy to be in touch offline if you want to be.
Well, thank you. So Philip, then Murray, you typed in a good question. You can read it after Philip, or I can read it for you if you wish, up to you, and then Charlie.
Taking a look at massive campaign, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, it dawns on me that we have to have the voice on the positive side. And I'm struck with the concept that you can't change anybody's opinion without making them laugh first, because that'll relax them. I put together a presentation called Christianity's Jewish Roots with Music and Humor. I have subsequently recorded this on Zoom. I presented at 6 churches, 4 Jewish organizations, and lately a couple of, lastly, St. Paul's College, Roman Catholic wing of the University of Manitoba. It has gotten generally good reception all over the place, along with laughter and the odd one singing along. It dawns on me when I'm doing a sort of church as I look out at who's there, and it's a lot of gray and white hair, which means my message is gone in 10 to 15 years. If we can hit the students, the message is there maybe 50 years. Anyway, that's sort of the flag I'm waving right now.
Thank you.
Well, I want to comment on that. I mean, it's very interesting. I think it's really important. It goes with this idea that we can't address anti-Semitism by trying to reach people intellectually alone. I really don't think, because when you talk about conspiracy theory, which anti-Semitism is, it operates on so many levels, right? It operates on the gut level, on the emotional level, and we have to find a way to reach people also on the gut level and emotionally somehow. That's a big challenge that I think we all face.
Yeah,
Thank you.
The idea is to, music is the language of emotion, and the laughter puts things in perspective. But to explain where Jews are coming from, where did Jesus come from? Well, he was Jewish. Who are all the apostles? They were Jewish. What are they teaching? Mainly Jewish values.
Thank you. I think we're going to move along, but humor is actually a very important part of Jewish culture and maybe our resistance to anti-Semitism. Mel Brooks, there's a lot of comedians that use anti-Semitism in their work. So thank you, Philip. Charlie, then Mary Jane.
I think that there's a failure of ignoring a lot of Zionist literature as a way of highlighting the offset to this anti-Zionism narrative. Much of Herzl's writings could be used, or much of other Zionist writings could be used in a constructive way to address some of these issues. Herzl wrote unbelievable things about the legitimacy of a Jewish homeland. We've just ignored it in the last several years, and I think that it behooves us to go back to Herzl's writings or other Zionist writings at this point in time. We're just ignoring it. I think the other thing I would just say is we are in a very dangerous place right now. The Saudis just turned their back on the West. The Saudis just got into bed with the Iranians and the Chinese. And that issue, and that is now tied to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is jeopardizing not only the Jewish state, but the whole world. So we have to, this anti-Zionism issue is much broader than just the anti-Semitic issue. It's much more dangerous. And we have to address these things now. Now. That's my only point. But I think there's a Zionist narrative that we've ignored, and there's a political narrative that's evolving that's really dangerous, very dangerous right now.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. Also, I think I just came back from Saudi Arabia, and I think that the situation in the Middle East is much more complicated. I think
always complicated, Charles.
It's much more complicated. I think this agreement with exchanging embassies may not be the be-all and end-all, but time will tell. I think it's more fluid. So Murray, your comment, and then Mary Jane. Sorry, Murray, you're muted. There you go.
I am a 92-year-old retired pharmacist who spends all his time on the internet listening to Zooms about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I have a blog, murrayrubin.ca, which I would love it if people would go to see. But I have noticed and I can't ignore it, that Jews are successful, far out of proportion to their numbers in any country. And because human beings are interested in themselves, all people find it convenient, some more than others, to hate Jews. It's part of their DNA to get ahead themselves. I have no answer. I wouldn't want Jews not to be successful, but I believe that is the reason that anti-Semitism has existed for thousands of years with the Romans and the Persians and the Russians. What do you have to say, Izabella, about what I have just said?
Well, I think it's complicated.
I was hoping, to be honest, for more than it is complicated. I wouldn't want Jews not to be successful, but we have to find a new way to fight anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because it is quite obvious to me what we have done has been very unsuccessful. We have to do something to change. I wish I had the answer. I wish you had the answer.
Right.
But there is no answer. And as I look at some of the faces on my screen, there is a little smile there because they all agree with me. And that is my problem for you, Izabella. What I'm hoping, though I can't guarantee it, that what happens in other countries to Jews will never happen in the United States and Canada, where I come from.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you very much. And we'll go to Mary Jane.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Great. Thank you very much for the talk, Izabella. I found it really quite fascinating. It's not a topic I know much about. I had sort of some questions which mainly are about to like some of the displays that you were showing, some of the images, they seem like quite elaborate and that quite a bit of effort had gone into creating those. And so I was interested to what extent sort of are these connected to the state, as in kind of who exactly is funding these? Because that almost seemed like it might be kind of one difference with when we're talking about far left or far right, in essence, that was this something that was coming from kind of the middle? Was this something the state was fully behind? Who exactly were these images produced by and the displays and things actually funded by? Also as well, kind of, was there any form of debate over the creation of this material too? And to what extent as well was it connected to kind of wider ideologies about kind of sort of communist East and kind of capitalist West there? So was there a kind of sort of anti-Western, anti-capitalist discourse within this? So sort of was there a wider, what was the wider discourse and the wider ideology around that? And to what extent was this connected to the state? I think that's what I'm trying to ask. Thank you.
Well, it was entirely produced by the state, you know, and this is the only reason this existed on this kind of scale. I mean, when you look at this, for example, at some of the publications that the Soviets put out around the world, it becomes very, very clear that this kind of thing could only exist in the conditions of unlimited resources, you know, unlimited state resources. I mean, who could be producing 100-page monthly magazine from a headquarters in Prague to be translated into 26 languages and to be distributed in 40 countries? I mean, it's a massive, and they would be gathering conferences all the time and discussing things, and events and things like that. And it was very much, so it was very much state-driven, state-produced, state-financed, all of it, just like everything else in the Soviet Union was state-produced and state-financed. Was there any debate about it? It's an interesting question. There actually was. So there were people in the Soviet Union at the time who believed, please forgive me, I don't know if you can hear my kitty meowing. There were people who really understood the anti-Semitic import of these ideas, and certainly in the scholarly environment, in institutions, the scholarly institutions, there were scholars who tried to argue that this was just unacceptable, that there was nothing scholarly about it, that this was propagandistic. And there were people who, you couldn't be pro-Zionist, but there were people who tried to be anti-Zionist more reasonably, just as we know it's possible, right? It's completely possible to criticize Zionism and Israel in non-conspiracist terms, right? It kind of in a scholarly and normal, regular, reasonable way. But so there was such a debate, and this debate actually reached even the Central Committee, which was really one of the coordinating agencies for this. There were people who believed that this went against Leninist views, and Lenin again was staunchly anti-Semitic. So yes, the debate did happen, but nothing really changed as a result of the debate. And here, again, that question that I raised kind of in a fleeting way in my talk, you ask yourself why. So there is a debate, and there are high-level people who believe that actually, this is not right. But nothing changes because the benefits, I think, are too judged to be too valuable. It's a question of who benefits and to what purposes is this propaganda used. During the Cold War, there were scholars in the West who thought that the Soviets put out this propaganda because they were sort of congenitally anti-Semitic, and this is what drove it. I actually don't think so. There were for sure, there were different agendas. So there were people for sure who were anti-Semitic, but I think it served a set of political purposes. There were foreign policy interests, the positioning in the Middle East, the ability to split Western public opinion on Israel and Jews, right? And then there was the domestic problem of Soviet Jews demanding the right to express themselves Jewishly, to practice religion and to emigrate and to learn Hebrew. So they wanted to swat all of that down. And this propaganda just sort of was this universal answer to a very big number of political problems that they faced. So I think that's why no changes were made. But after the Soviet Union fell apart, there was an acknowledgement that this was really unacceptable. And what was your third question? Who produced it? Was there a debate? And there was another question.
I was talking about sort of the wider narrative that it was part of?
Right. Well, it definitely.
You've almost basically answered it, but please continue.
Yeah, no, it definitely fit into the broader approach to propaganda. So this is actually really important. So, for example, when the Soviets accused Zionists of operating in cahoots with Mossad and the CIA, and they did it. What was the purpose of saying that at home? It was in order to to tell Soviet Jews, don't get involved with Zionism. Otherwise you'll be viewed as an asset of foreign intelligence agencies, and that could carry actually a death sentence. But something like this was also applied against other groups and other, whatever the Soviets were fighting at the time, kind of the enemy du jour. So, for example, they used to say that, like there was a lot of propaganda against Ukrainian nationalism. There was propaganda, trying to kind of counteract the influence of, let's say, the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, right? This broadcast. So they would use the same kind of ideas, to say, well, these people collaborated with the Nazis. Soviet emigres collaborated with the Nazis. This is produced by the imperialist forces. So there are for sure connections. This propaganda very much fits into this general kind of propaganda approach that the Soviets use.
May I ask one follow-up question for that, please?
Go ahead.
Just quickly, was that, you sort of talk about it being part of a much kind of wider discourse in that way. Thank you. Was there any evidence of any other countries being involved in this and say coming out with the same sort of discourse? And is there any evidence of any other kind of interference from other states anyway?
Anti-Zionist discourse, Soviet anti-Zionist discourse?
Yes, the sort of general kind of discourse that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you saw it in Poland, for example. In 1968, there was a big campaign in Poland, which was based against Jews, which was based on the same ideas, the anti-Zionist ideas. When you had the Soviet tanks enter Czechoslovakia in 68, also in August of 68, there were kind of these rumors. This was all guided from Moscow, by the way, of course, that Zionists were trying to instigate a revolution in the socialist camp and defeat socialist forces, etc. I was told, I've never researched it, but I was told by a Cuban Jewish friend, that they had the same rhetoric in Cuba as well after 67, which was part of the reason they emigrated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we get to Stephen, I would like to, there's some questions online from Anita Brahm. She wrote, it seems that we're losing the argument. Pro-Palestinian rhetoric, including anti-Zionism rhetoric, is being adopted into the school systems here in Canada and beyond. Thanks for your great talk, clear. But how do we address this as concerned citizens? That's the first question. Then we have Lawrence Bruce, who said, he writes that 4 journalists located in Beirut for the French television station France 24 were suspended for 2 days because they tweeted openly anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist messages which called for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews. And one tweet was by this journalist, one Palestinian should kill a few Jews and the problem will be settled. And the question is, does this happen in the United States or within British media? And what do you make of this, I guess, soft punishment of a 2-day suspension?
Well, the first question, how do we address it as concerned citizens? I think if I had the answer, I think, we would all be in a good place. I do think, coming from the perspective that I come from, I think that if we can communicate, obviously education is really important, right? And I think sometimes this conversation about whether anti-Zionism is or isn't the same as anti-Semitism is conducted in this way as if, in the abstract, as if it never happened, as if we've never seen anti-Zionism being adopted broadly. Right. But here, the history that I talk about, one of the reasons I think it's important to understand is that it's a case study of what happens actually to a Jewish Jewish groups, to a Jewish community, to the Jewish population, when a society adopts, the mainstream society adopts broadly this kind of politically weaponized anti-Zionist rhetoric. And it's a very well documented study. We know that Soviet Jews experienced extensive repression, oppression, right? They were excluded from professional fields. They were excluded from certain educational opportunities. They couldn't practice their religion, their culture. They couldn't study Hebrew. They couldn't travel even to Israel, forget emigrate, right? So I think that when this is actually a very clear-cut case of what happens when anti-Zionism gets adopted. When it does, I think it's clear that reality shows, right? Practice shows, Soviet practice, right? We just talked about Poland. We see that the anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews are inevitable. And I think, not everybody can learn all the history that I teach, or write about. But I think if we just understand this one simple thing, if we just understand this basic idea, I think that can already help us understand why what we're seeing today is so dangerous, right? And why it's really important that we fight it. In fact, I would argue that we see some of these outcomes already for American Jews, right? There are already fields that where Jews feel that they're being pushed out of. There are political environments that Jews are not welcome in. We see what's happening on American campuses. And so much of it happens under the banner of anti-Zionism. So I think we just really have to open our eyes to this, and knowing this history, knowing even a little bit of this history, can help to do that. As for the second question, what's there to say? I think it's terrible that it's not being punished as much as it should be. But I think things like this do happen in the United States for sure, and I think in Canada as well. I certainly know America better, but I think it's not anything exceptional, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Stein.
Izabella, great research. I really commend you for the work you've been doing. My question is kind of twofold. On the one hand, do you have any thoughts on why some people are more susceptible to the propaganda? And as a psychologist, one of the areas I'm interested in is, of course, influencing people and change them. And you mentioned how facts don't work, and we know that. And we're looking at other sort of social psychological approaches to changing people's attitudes regarding conspiracy theories. But what are your thoughts on why people, or which people, are more susceptible than others?
Well, we know that somebody who is generally susceptible to conspiracy theory will also be susceptible to anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I mean, that I think is a given. I think at the time, let's say in the 70s and 80s, and it's probably true today as well, if you are generally part of that kind of radical left, and this is a given, this is a kind of a default position among your peers, then I think you will simply adopt it because it's part of being part of this group. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily even think about the meaning of these ideas. They just adopt them as a package, right, with everything that comes with being on the anti-Israel left. So these are just my thoughts. How do you change people's opinions? That, if we look at the radical left, I think it's the same as the radical right. I don't know if you can necessarily change their opinions. I think we really have to focus our efforts on people in the middle, people. So in this case, who are the people in the Jewish community who have not yet, become radicalized, or in the broader society, but I mostly think about, the changes in the American Jewish community. How do you prevent more American Jews from falling for this kind of propaganda? I think there, facts, education, history can still help. I don't think that they can help on the radical side.
Okay, thank you. Bob Fishman.
This is really very enlightening, and I appreciate your talk. Can you go back to the 1975 Zionism versus racism resolution at the UN? And was it the Soviet Union that was leading the charge, or was it the Arab world and the Soviet Union together, or some combination?
Well, I believe that the Soviet Union led the charge behind the scenes. It wasn't at the front. There were other countries that were at the front, but the Soviet Union had a very powerful, very massive influence at the UN. And I think that they really were. It was their their kind of action and their, I don't know the kind of the blow by blow there, but it's Soviet influence for sure.
You know, also I would tell you, I was a student at McGill University and did some work with Erwin Kotler, the human rights professor and later the Minister of Justice. And he documented that actually Kurt Waldheim, of all people, who was the Secretary General of the UN at the moment, organized a party at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York City celebrating that Zionism was racism resolution. Wow. So here you have a Nazi war criminal working with Soviet propagandists. So this is exactly what you've been saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
And can I just try to answer a little bit to what Murray Rubin was saying, and God bless you at your age to be as much engaged in this effort. When I speak to Black friends, it's very clear that they admire Jews because of our.
I don't want to take away from the seminar. If we could ask questions to Izabella, that would be great. Rather than if you have a question to Izabella, please proceed, Bob. If not, let's let somebody else.
Okay, at some time I'd like to talk to Murray. So if somebody can send me his
Murray, is it okay
email,
if we send Bob your contact information? Okay, Daphne will introduce you by email.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Cool. And are there any other comments or questions for Izabella?
Did a great job.
Okay. Izabella, so on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much for presenting to us and for all the work you're doing on this very important subject. And
thank you. Thank you very much.
And you're a research fellow at ISGAP, so thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. So that's it for now. Stay tuned for next week. Daphne or El Shaddai, are you online? You want to?
Yes, I am online. Yeah. 1 second, my internet is not so good, as you know.
Okay. And
we have a webinar next week. You can get all the information on the ISGAP website at isgap.org. Everything's on the front page. We have these webinars every Tuesday until late April. So I hope to see everybody here next week.
And we'll have Ahmed Shahid next week.
Right. So thank you, El Shaddai. So Ahmed Shahid was the special rapporteur in the United Nations on issues of anti-Semitism, and he's a professor of law at Exeter, a very important speaker next week. So I hope you can join us. Thank you, Izabella, and everybody have a great week.